Right, let's go to the domestic front now and the political situation in Scotland. Yesterday, the First Minister Humza Yousaf had to stop a speech following a very loud intervention from a heckler at a special conference meant to set out how the SNP would plot a path to independence. Well, heckling is probably the least of his worries, with the party still mired in chaos following financial scandals and arrests, including that of his predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon. Oh, and the polls are looking pretty grim for the party that has dominated Scottish politics for so long. Well, I'm joined now by the First Minister, Humza Yousaf. Good morning, Mr. Yousaf. Joining us from Dundee.
And just as per your introduction, it's probably worth me saying that in virtually every single poll that has come out, of course, we still continue to be the party that leads every single other party in Scotland. But I just thought I'd just throw that in there, given your very kind introduction of me.
Well, kind of you to fill us in on that, but we'll come back to that in a second. You said yesterday that you would make the next general election a referendum on independence. Does that mean that, as your predecessor clarified, that if you got 50% of the vote, you would consider that a mandate for independence? But would it also mean that if you didn't get 50%, you just drop it?
First of all, it's not what I said, so I'll clarify in a second. It's worth reminding people that, of course, our preferred option, the option for which we have multiple mandates for, the option which the majority of the Scottish Parliament backs, is, of course, for that legally binding referendum. Now, that has been denied time and time again by the UK government. So my message is pretty simple. We will use the next general election to test the proposition. We'll put a very simple proposition to the people of Scotland on page 1, line 1 of our manifesto. A vote for the SNP is a vote for Scotland to become an independent country. Now, if we win that general election, we'll then seek to negotiate with the UK government how we give democratic effect to that proposition. And we're only going down this route, of course, because I continue to reiterate, because the UK government, Westminster parties continue to deny us the right to a referendum.
But so forgive me for interrupting you. When you say if we win that general election, what does that constitute? Does that mean most seats in Scotland? Does that mean 50% of the vote? What does winning the general election mean?
Sure, I'm happy to clarify, but I suspect you have covered more general elections than I have even been involved in campaigning. In every single general election, everybody knows the rules of a general election. The party that wins the most seats wins the general election. So again, if you want to test a proposition for popular support, which is a fair enough ask to do, in fact, it's what we want to do. If you want to test a proposition for popular support, you do that via referendum. That's no different to any democratic country in the world that wants to test a proposition for popular support. But the rules of a general election are thus that, of course, the party that wins the most seats wins that general election.
OK, so if you win more seats than anybody else, you are going to take that as a mandate to push for a further referendum. Now, both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have said it doesn't really matter what comes out, you're not getting one. What are you going to do to force their hands? And by the way,
well, first and
it's
foremost,
perfectly legal for them to say that.
Well, first and foremost, I would put it to Keir Starmer, to Rishi Sunak, very simply. You continue to tell Scotland that this is a voluntary union, then prove it. If you're saying that you can't have your independence via a referendum, I'm afraid we will not accept any mandate that's given to you via a general election. This is a voluntary union. How on earth does Scotland become independent? But the question you ask is a very fair one, and the second part of my speech, in fact, one of the main arguments that I was making to our activists and reminding our activist base of, is that it's so important for us to ensure that we have a consistent majority supporting independence. So while, of course, we'll be campaigning in that general election, what we're doing right now is campaigning to make sure that we have that settled will, that consistent majority in Scotland that support independence, because it is the power of the people that I don't doubt will break Westminster's intransigence.
If I can just get clear something here. I mean, we're talking about democracy. If there's a general election and either Mr Sunak or Sir Keir Starmer are in Downing Street, they will have gone to the country with a manifesto that says we are not going to have another referendum. They will have won. In what way is it not democratic for them to fulfil their mandate given to them by a a general election of the United Kingdom. Scotland's not independent yet.
Well, there's two points to make on that. Of course, if we beat Labour in Scotland, then of course we win the general election here in Scotland. If you are saying that Scotland can continue to be denied a referendum because they are outvoted by the fact that the rest of the UK have more seats, then I would say to you very gently that that is the democratic deficit which we are continuing to rail against, I'm afraid, because there is a deficit in that regard. So you are essentially saying unless the rest of the UK allows you to become independent, allows you to have a referendum, and that's the only way you can become independent. That, to me, doesn't sound like a voluntary union at all.
OK. All right. Well, look, we could go on about that, but let's go on to the circumstances in which you govern. Perhaps the best way of persuading everybody that Scotland should be independent would be to have a brilliant performance by the SNP government in Scotland. So let's address a couple of issues which don't depend on Westminster's say-so for agreement. For example, the NHS. You were responsible for it in Scotland between May 21 and March 1923. Now, the number of patients on waiting list in Scotland is up to 780,000. There are over 18,000 people who died waiting for treatment, a rise of 39% compared with 2019. It's not a stellar record, is it?
Your suggestion that somehow that is unique to Scotland, it would frankly
I'm
be
not
absurd.
suggesting it's unique. I'm just saying it's not very good for Scotland.
Well, it's the proposition that it's the premise that underlines your question. That would be absurd, of course, because a global pandemic, by its definition, has affected health services right across the world. The pandemic was the biggest shock that hit our NHS in its almost 75-year existence. In terms of the NHS here in Scotland, we stand on a record that shows that Scotland's A&E departments are the best performing for well over 7 years. In fact, in the winter that's just passed, there was only one nation in the UK that didn't lose a single day to strikes in the NHS. That was Scotland, of course, while I was Health Secretary. And when it comes to those longest waits on the NHS, if you look at those people who've been waiting for over 2 years, we've made dramatic reductions when it's inpatients, outpatients, or indeed for those that are waiting for diagnostic tests. So there are challenges with the NHS. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but that's undoubtedly been exacerbated by that global pandemic. But we're absolutely focused on making sure that we can recover our NHS and social care. And just on that point, you say it's not connected to anything that Westminster does. Well, we all know that you don't recover your NHS without recovering your social care. One of the biggest challenges we have, of course, has been Brexit. If you ask anybody involved in social care, they will tell you how much of the workforce in social care we've lost because of that hard Brexit, which Scotland didn't vote for.
We're wandering a bit away from your government's performance. It's still not better. It's not really.
I'm sorry. I just don't agree. If you want to talk about the SNP's record, of course, there's a report out 2 weeks ago showing that because of our actions, an estimated 90,000 children will be lifted out of poverty. If you want to look at our record, an Ernst & Young report out just last week shows that Scotland outpaces the rest of the UK and indeed Europe when it comes to foreign direct investment. You want to talk about our record, you've got the best performing A&E departments in the entire UK. If you want to talk about our record, we have more young people going to university from deprived areas in Scotland than ever before. I can go on and on and on if you want, but ultimately it is the verdict of the people, and they keep trusting the SNP
Nobody would
in
say
government.
that you are responsible for some of the, let's call them shenanigans that have taken place in the party, but you have inherited a situation which has damaged the SNP. Can I just get clear one thing? Are there any circumstances in which you would remove the whip from the MSP and former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon?
I'm not going to get hypotheticals about what might happen in a live police investigation. You should know better than that, of course, that it's inappropriate for ministers, First Ministers, any elected politician to, of course, comment on what is a live police investigation.
I'm just asking if you can imagine...
I've made it...
I'm not asking you what circumstances
I've made it very, very,
I'm just
very
asking
clear.
if you can imagine circumstances in which she would lose the whip.
Again, I'm not going to make this about either Nicola Sturgeon or anybody else, but what I will say is those that have been released without charge have been consistent. They have not had the whip removed for them or their party membership suspended. We'll keep that situation under review, but it is a live police investigation and one that I'm not keen to comment on for that very reason.
You do accept, though, don't you, that this has been pretty catastrophic for your party. You're the chief executive of the party, arrested in April, missing 30,000 members, the purchase of a luxury motorhome worth £110,000. Did you know any of that when you stood for the leadership?
No, and I made that clear at the time. And look, I'm not going to argue with your central proposition. I mean, it's probably been the most difficult few months of the party's recent modern history. But I'm the leader and I've got to make sure I do everything I can to ensure that there's stability within the party, that we are open and transparent. That's why I instructed a governance and financial oversight, financial review as well. So the party is conducting that at the moment. But it's also why it's important for me to galvanise our party, and that's why we had such a great convention here in the city of Dundee just yesterday. So despite all those challenges, it's worth me reiterating what I did at the very opening of the interview. We are still the most popular party in Scotland in virtually every single poll, and of course we have by far the most members than any other political party here in Scotland. So that's a pretty good base to build upon.
I just want to give you the opportunity to respond to what I think some people say. You've been a very senior member of the SNP government for a long time, best part of a decade. It is hard to understand that you would not have any consciousness of any of these issues until after you became elected as the party's leader. You can understand why that seems bizarre to an outsider.
Not really, because nobody's really asked that question before, because people generally tend to understand that you can be a senior member of the government. That doesn't mean you're a senior member necessarily of the party, because I've actually never had an office-bearing position in the party, and for almost 20 years that I've been involved in the party. I've had a number of pretty tricky jobs that have kept me busy in government, whether it was Transport Minister, Justice Secretary, or indeed Health Secretary, as you just alluded to a moment ago. So, I'll be up front. You asked me a pretty straight question. Did I know about the various different issues that you raised before they were made public in the media? No. The answer to that very simply is no.
All right, one other thing which has caused you quite a lot of trouble. I know that the Parliament has passed the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, but it is an extremely unpopular bill, according to polls in Scotland. Barely 1 in 5 people support it. Labour has said it won't support it. Tories have said they won't support it. Are you going to continue pushing for that through legal action in the courts?
Well, first of all, let me correct your assertion again, and this is really basic, actually, that, of course, the Labour Party did support the Gender Reform Recognition Bill, as did the Liberal Democrats, as did the Greens, as did the SNP, and indeed some members of the Conservative parties. We had members of every single party supporting the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. Actually, this is a pretty simple issue of democracy. Whether you agree with the substance of the GRR bill or not, we have a bill that's been passed by the majority of Parliament that is within our devolved competency, which has then been vetoed by a UK government. That, to me, is another example of a Westminster government that's looking and seeking to undermine devolution time and time again.
All right, forgive me, I'm just interrupting you because something has just landed, which I just want to ask you about. It's the breaking news. Scotland Fire and Rescue is saying that alongside other services across the UK, the national 999 system is experiencing technical problems and they're urging people to phone other numbers. Your reaction, how worrying is that as somebody who's been responsible for one of those emergency services in health and so on?
That is, of course, concerning, and we're, of course, working with Scottish Fire and Rescue and others to see if that situation can be resolved. As you know, the UK works right across the UK on that 999 airwaves system, so any problems will, of course, work and collaborate with partners right across the UK in that regard. But, of course, the situation, as you've expressed it, is one of concern.
First Minister, thank you very much for your time this morning. It's been good to talk to you.
Thank you.